Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our event. It's a seminar meeting on international aspects of the First World War and the battle for Lwów, 1918. And we will be discussing the good labors of Professor Andrzej Chwalba and Dr. Damian Markowski. I will chime in from time to time from the United States. We will be presenting awards, but mostly talking about the First World War. We're all historians. Obviously, many think history is irrelevant, especially here in the United States, but for us, history matters. We can hopefully derive some lessons from it, both at the international level and at the local level, at the micro study of the battle for Lwów in 1918. Without much further ado, I'd like to yield the floor to Mr. Paweł Kurtyka, President of the Board of the Janusza Kurtyka Foundation. Please go ahead.
Szanowni Państwo, dziękuję bardzo Panie Profesorze za...
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, Professor. Thank you very much for moderating the session. I have the honor of telling about our project in a few words, and I would like to present information about the current state of play of our project. That is the Janusz Kurtyki Award. What is the current state of play of this project? In fact, for more than 6 years now, we have been running this project, and today we are taking part in a promotional meeting of two published and translated books that have won the prize, the Janusz Kurtyka Prize. So this is the book of Professor Andrzej Chwalba, and this is the English language publication of the Polish work of the people of Poland at war, 1914-1918. And the other book is the book by Damian Markowski, PhD, that is the book called Two Uprisings 1918, Lwów or Lwów. Two Uprisings 1918. And in fact, on the one hand, this is the final stage of work on those two publications, because once those two publications have been published and translated, we are right at the very end of this project, and now we are going to have a series of promotional meetings. We're going to talk about those two books, and we're going to talk about history. However, as far as other people are concerned who have not been in the backstage, so to speak, those meetings will be quite useful, because we will be we'll have an opportunity to talk about the work of our foundation and talk about the books. And those two books are very significant because we are focusing. Those are the periods of time that have shaped us as the Poles, and in this particular case, given that our partner is the Institute of World Politics, we should also say that those events shaped the political and geopolitical space of Central and Eastern Europe in the beginning of the 20th century. So we need to look into social processes that were taking place on the Polish lands. Those are the processes described by Professor Chwalba. And the result of those processes was that the World War I concluded for Poles the way it did. So it was a beneficial conclusion of the war with the establishment of the independent Polish state. So from this social perspective, not only from the macro-political point of view, not only from the military point of view, we need to understand that there were some factors at play that finally gave the Poles a possibility of succeeding So we need to understand what were the social pressures at the time, and undoubtedly the Polish society that lived in the territories of the Republic of Poland was also subjected to some pressures due to the presence of armies that were present in those territories, but also social positions were being shaped at the time, and eventually that allowed the Poles to use a favorable political situation and thus to establish the independent Polish state. But also this has helped them to consolidate Polish society and to consolidate the Poles around this idea of establishing new Poland. And in fact, new Poland was strong enough to repel the Bolsheviks. So we have to talk about also this statehood myth that was being promoted. The defense of Lwów was quite an important myth, that is the collection of the former lands, especially in southeastern lands. That was quite an important myth, and to a certain extent it was present in the state propaganda, and it was very much used in the state propaganda by the state propaganda so as to show the potency and the effectiveness of the Polish state born. So, as a matter of fact, today we are discussing this phenomenon of Poland of those days, and why the foundation has chosen those two books. Well, undoubtedly, this choice is the result of the centenary of the regaining of independence by Poland, and we believe that those two books show very well how the Poles were fighting for independence at that time. And these books show very well the ideals they were fighting for and the pressures they had to face. But these books present those events in a modern way. And those books have been written in of the Polish history abroad. Both books have been published by us, not only in the English language, because today we're talking about the English language publication, but we also have those books translated into the German language. And we are active in the US and in the UK, but we also publish in Germany, Switzerland, German. Move on, and could you please feature the video material that presents Professor Andrzej Chwalba's book?
In 1914, the great powers clashed and waged a war that shaped lives of generations. In the wake of the great conflict, some new nations emerged. Others recovered their long-lost independence. This book tells the story of a nation divided for over a century between three empires. A tale of heroism and defiance, of patriots who wanted to fly their own colors. Far from the trenches of Verdun and the rocky shores of Gallipoli, a different war was being waged. A war for independence and freedom. After over a century of oppression, Poland was to be free again. The People of Poland at War, 1914 to 1918. By Professor Andrzej Chwalba, available on Amazon.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you very much. So as you can see, Professor Chwalba's books and Dr. Markowski's books are already available at Amazon.com. So we do encourage those of you who are interested to reach out for those books, or you can buy them directly at our foundation. But this video material shows the way we are going to use in order to reach out to the broader audience with these two publications. This is living history, and we are trying to depict this history in a very vivid way, and hence there are short video materials that show the climate, the ambience of those books, and thus those video materials give a better feel of what those books are about. And now I'd like to give the floor to Dr. Damian Markowski, and soon after we will also give the floor to Professor Chwalba. But Professor, over to you. And now the second video material.
Many cultures, ornamented by splendid monuments of architecture, renowned for its scholarship, arts, and sciences. Lwów, the capital of Galicia in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, could vie with Prague or Vienna for grandeur. Each of the ethnic communities that inhabited it, Poles, Ukrainians, Jews, Armenians, to name but the largest, considered Lwów its very own. When the Habsburg Empire crumbled, the flames of civil war engulfed the city of lions. Lwów or Lwów, Two Uprisings in 1918 by Damian K. Markowski, is a book which tells the story of the bitter contention, looking at the developments from the point of view of both belligerents. Available on Amazon.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you very much. Closing, I would also like to thank the institution without which this project would be impossible to conduct for the financial partnership reason. And that's the Ministry of Education and Science that supports our project. It has done so for over 2 years. So we are grateful to our partner. And it is thanks to the partner that we can continue our activity and operation and publish the best works that have gone through a 2-stage competition, scientific competition, that the Foundation has organized annually since 2016. Could I now ask you for speech? We have 2 authors today. Could we start with Professor Andrzej Chwalba? It's about your book, and Professor, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
If I'm
Good
reading
afternoon.
I'm sorry, just for 1 second.
Przepraszam bardzo.
If I'm reading this correctly, it says number 3, paper by Dr. Marek Jan Chodakiewicz. I'm very happy to skip that if this is your wish, but that's what it says on my plan. So thank you, Mr. Kurtyka, for making me free.
Panie profesorze,
Professor, you are absolutely right. No, it's just my mistake and error. I had, I believe, discrepancy in my notes. So yes, of course, let's go on with point 3, please.
But I am absolutely not offended. I enjoy listening to Professor Chwalba. I can understand Polish very well, so it's not a big deal. And I'm not going to say anything interesting, at least not anything interesting for historians, maybe for a general audience. But if Professor Chwalba wishes to go first, I'm fine. I can conclude with my little spiel. Whatever your desire, whatever you prefer. So if you want me to go first, say so. If not, I'm turning the floor over to Professor Chwalba. Okay, so I'll go first. I'd like to stress that we're dealing here with 2 distinct phenomena. One is a general panorama, international panorama, and then a case study, the battle for Lwów. 2 distinct phenomena, both indispensable to understanding history. In fact, they are not contradictory. They weave and mesh together, because it is individuals and localities whose collective experience accumulates in general international history. Until 1989, or actually until now, there hasn't registered in the West the special predicament of the old Commonwealth lands between the Black and Baltic and the Adriatic seas. This is something that Professor Falba and Dr. Markowski remedies splendidly. I would like to tell you an anecdote, how international all of this is. One of my relatives, Schwiegerleute, was a German cavalry officer, and he was also an avid card player. He lost a lot of money in cards. His father, who was a Statthalter for one of the prime minister of one of the component states of the German Empire, he became upset, and card debts were honor debts, which the son, his name was Graf Prašma Freiherr von Bilkau, or Pražma z Bilkova. They were Czechs, Catholics who became Germanized after the Battle of White Mountain. So his father paid off his debt, but the punishment for the son was to accept commission and nomination to be the commander of the cadet officers school in Tianjin, China. During World War I, he and his detachment, including the Chinese, fought against the Allies, that means the Japanese and the Brits. He was taken prisoner. Then he was handed over to the British after about, I think, a month of fighting or so, where he found himself rather enjoyable in my family. Of course, from early childhood, I was used to different stories, particularly Polish stories like the Battle for Lwów. Two of my in the Russian Empire, both of them were assigned to railroads. They were both officers. And another one was taken as a hostage by the Bolsheviks and continued to fulfill functions, technical functions, as the stories that you learn at your grandmother's knee, if she cares to tell you, or if she knows, remembers. I would like you to think about those individual stories before you delve into the world of great politics. After all, diplomacy, strategy are made by humans, individual humans. So I would like to read to you a few quotes that illustrate World War I, in my opinion, best. And I'd like you to ponder the influence of individuals, not just collective efforts, not just material means, but individuals on history. Individuals who said, no, by the way, no, we're not going to agree. Oh, by the way, we are going to do, or I am going to do what is right, not what pays. Because when you look at the situation in 1914, there was no way for anybody sane to hope for anything better but some kind of autonomy under the Habsburgs or the Romanovs, as far as the Poles are concerned. Much less there was to be expected from the Prussians. Despite that, in the old Commonwealth, as we call it, Rzeczpospolita, or as shorthand as Poland, there were individuals who simply refused to acknowledge overriding realities. They simply said, we're going to fight for Poland. They didn't want to hear about anything realistic. And even those who deemed themselves to be realists, like the Austrian orientation in Poland, so stick with the Habsburgs, they'll give us what we want, or the pro-Western orientation, as in the National Democrats and Romanowski, they were also unrealistic, because in 1914 it appeared that all the cards were in the hands of the powerful, and it made no sense to make any effort toward anything. I'm just talking logically. I'm not talking through the heart. So let me translate and read to you, because some of this is in English, a few quotes that reflect what I have just been talking about. Pull them up. Okay. The first quote is from a letter of Count Zygmunt Krasiński to Count Jan Zamoyski in April 1856. Krasiński writes, "No, my dear, good people shall do nothing for us. There will be much suffering and afflictions inflicted on us. The nation of ours shall experience horrible torture, torture that one will never dream about. But after many, many years, there will be a great war in which all states of Europe will participate. And it will mostly take place in our country. And this country, broad and wide, shall be drenched in tears and blood, destruction, fires, depopulation, all sort of suffering will absolutely be more than anything that our nation, our country have suffered so far." And then, good God, to make the suffering of good people even worse, but to his greater glory, will order Satan to restore Poland, and the very people who had torn her apart will be fighting on the throwing members of Poland, tearing out from each other's hands those pieces and making bets who is going to do more for her resurrection. This is a morbid vision from 1856, a morbid vision that Krasiński, in which Krasiński argued that there would be a world war, and that the people responsible for the destruction of the Commonwealth of Poland would be the ones who will resurrect it for their own political reasons. Okay, there is another quote from a professor at the University of Vilna, later in exile, Wiktor Sukiennicki. He wrote, "On the eve of World War I, the existence both of the former Commonwealth and the question about the necessity to unify all her lands, which was entered into the Treaty of Vienna of 1815, had long been forgotten. The western border of the Russian Empire was considered absolutely and legally legitimate, and Russian internal problems were completely ignored in international issues. What Professor Sukiennicki is saying, that the so-called Polish question following the January uprising of 1863 was no longer international and no longer internationalized. It was considered strictly as a Russian domestic question. Sergei Witte, a sagacious prime minister of the Russian Empire, he wrote in a memorandum to Tsar Nicholas I in October 1905 as follows: "The Russian rebellion, mindless and pitiless, will sweep everything, turn everything to dust. What kind of Russia will emerge from this unexampled trial surpasses human imagination. The horrors of the Russian Bund may exceed everything known to history. It is possible that foreign intervention will tear the country apart. Attempts to put into practice the ideals of theoretical socialism, they will fail, but they will be made, no doubt about it. They will destroy the family, the expression of religious faith, property, all the foundations of law." So Witte in 1905, October 1905. Very, very prescient, very prescient. And now I have a quote from a German intellectual, Jörg Brechtefeld, a contemporary intellectual. He wrote, "Mitteleuropa as an economic base would enable Germany to survive the struggle. Pan-German thinking and demands were a conglomerate of Ernst Haeckel's notion of social Darwinism, Paul de Lagarde's writings on German folklore, Deutschtum, and Friedrich Ratzel's geopolitical idea of Lebensraum. Philosophically, a popularized version of Nietzsche's Übermensch, Herrenvolk, and the will to power were blended into pan-German views. By the turn of the century, the economic and cultural elements of the public Mitteleuropa debate had merged with the Grossdeutsch sentiments of the period." So your when the marching, Viscount Grey of Faldon, the British Prime Minister, said, "The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime." And he was right. What kind of a war was this one? That was hitherto the greatest of them all. Major Donald McRae of the United States, he was a combat veteran, in military surgeon in February 1919. So this is a medical publication of the United States military. Major Donald McRae wrote, "If any enemy wounded are found in the trench, they should be bayoneted if sufficient prisoners for interrogation have been taken. Forget about chivalry. Kill the prisoners, especially the wounded." A contemporary historian, Jochen Bühler, had this to say in his otherwise deeply flawed monograph, Civil War in Central Europe, the reconstruction of Poland, due to the training and the commitment to the cause they were fighting for, the Polish units sometimes displayed a higher morale than their comrades in the imperial armies. Nevertheless, their symbolic value and often heroic war record notwithstanding, their deployment had no significant influence on the outcome of the war. Be that as it may, this motley assortment of farraginous forces, which all for themselves claimed to represent the Polish nation, in the reality mattered little before independence was achieved. Over the course of the Great War, the overwhelming majority of the Polish-speaking men able to carry arms were peasants who were drafted into the imperial armies. And although they shared a primitive form of national identity, the attachment to their language, religion, towns, and microculture, their attitude towards the formation of nation states after the Great War was hard to predict. Well, less sneering, it looks like Bühler has hit upon something. Indeed, only the chosen few among the Poles elected to fight, and indeed only a few were permitted to fight. Comparable numbers in the Polish legions on the Austro-Hungarian side to the Legion Puławski on the Russian side, but that's not because the Poles didn't want to fight under their own banners. It's because the partitioning powers were interested in throwing them a bone, allowing them to play a symbolic role. And of course, the partitioning powers, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, wanted to control the Polish fighting men. Polish, whether they were conscious of that, or Polish who were conscious of that. Most of them fought obviously, in the partitioning powers armies and had no say in anything. But the question arises, what would have happened had there been no separate Polish formations? What would have happened had there been no Polish paramilitary units, Polish conspiracy? Then when the miracle of the implosion and destruction of the three empires, Russia, Germany, and Austria-Hungary, happened, then there wouldn't have been anybody organizing anything. So perhaps, yes, in 1914 and even in 1917, it may have looked in January 1917 that it didn't really matter that there were a few Polish units because the empires were still standing. But you also should be able to imagine a possibility that you may be needed when everything goes to hell in the handbasket. And that's precisely the same level of organization, mobilization, and sophistication. And so did everybody else. But nobody, for the Poles, nobody dreamt about independent Ukraine in 1914, except for a few Poles. Nobody dreamt about independent Poland, but at least people who played the realist card, so the loyalists, mostly in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and they would have loved to have an independent Poland. Lithuanian, Ukrainian, Belarusian, and other activists in 1914 never thought in terms of independence and a nation state. That was so beyond anyone's dreams and comprehension that it boggles the mind. Eventually, the war radicalized the populations, and the war, with the collapse of the empires, made it possible to develop a vision of independent nation states. The difference between the Poles and the rest was that the Poles were a historic nation. So people with last names like Chodakiewicz, which is Ruthenian from Rus, and Totleben, who were the sword-bearing cavaliers, Herbu Jastrzębiec, Hawk was their coat of arms when they became Polish nobility. Martini, you know all the names, Polish, Tatar, Italian, Scotch names, MacDonald's from Wilno. They all felt Polish. They were the old elite of the old Commonwealth. Most of their followers, the rank and file, tended to be ethnic Poles, Catholics, but not only. As for the competing nationalism, they were all folk nationalism, modeled after the German paradigm of romantic nationalism with more than a whiff of social Darwinism. So we have folk nationalist imagination of the Ukrainians, Belarusians, and universalistic imagination of Polish nationalism, Polish Jagiellonian nationalism that inherited the legacy of the old Commonwealth. And I am talking here not just about romantics like Joseph Piłsudski. I'm talking about people like Roman Dmowski, the National Democrat, who was stuck with the Polish elite, understood in the most broad sense, not narrowly folk nationalist, not integral nationalist, but Jagiellonian. And that is, ladies and gentlemen, indispensable background to understand what my esteemed colleagues will tell us. And just to make sure that my least favorite politician on the Allied side doesn't escape unscathed, I shall quote from Prime Minister David Lloyd George's speech at the House of Commons on May 13th, 1921. Without waiting for discussion between governments, the Polish population raised an insurrection and put us in the difficulty of having to deal with a fait accompli. That is the state of the case. It's a complete defiance of the Treaty of Versailles. It may be a bad treaty, it may be a harsh treaty, but the last country in Europe that has a right to complain is Poland. Now, David Lloyd George was referring to the Silesian uprisings, of course, but he may as annoyed him more than Poland, and he hated few things more than the Poles, and that is by a way of signaling that except for America, for idealistic reasons, there was only France talking a good talk and helping out, but not with weapons. The United States fed the Poles with the Hoover Mission, and it healed the sick. Not so much anybody else. As Andrzej Nowak, Professor Andrzej Nowak, wrote about the first betrayal of Poland, and he's absolutely right. I hope that book will be published in English very soon as well. Thank you very much. And now I think it's Professor Falba's turn.
Good evening. Thank you very much for the blessing extended by Professor Chodakiewicz and for the introduction by Mr. Kurtyka. I just would like to say that the book does not focus only and exclusively, and it doesn't actually focus on international matters whatsoever. My task was different. My task was to show how mobilizing Polish society in the context of the changes taking place in Europe, how all of that have led to the phenomenon of I apologize, I lost sound. There is no sound. I lost sound. Professor Chwalba is muted. Please unmute Professor Chwalba's microphone.
Professor Chwalba has muted himself. Professor, you have to unmute yourself and start again because you're muted. Sorry.
Przepraszam, ja przed chwilą właśnie.
I apologize. Yes, right. So again, once again, I would like to thank you very much for the blessing, Professor Chodkiewicz, and also would like to thank Mr. Kurtyka for the introduction. So the idea of this book is reminiscent to what is called in the historiography as global history. So that is the type of history that in different proportions combines modern fragments of his own family history. In my book, we shall also find histories of many different families, because if we talk only and exclusively from the point of view of the great rulers of the world, it does not actually make sense. We need to make reference to those who were, as someone said it, the dawn of history, or the fertilizing agents of history. They were objects, not subjects. They were anonymous, but without those anonymous, history would not happen. And at the same time, my book also juxtaposes history with memory. It is difficult not to remember about how memory was being shaped of several generations after 1918, and what happened after and what happened during the Great War between 1914 and 1918.
At the end, we can say that we have the social, community, international, political, and military subjects and threats. We also have a tale about the military activity in the Polish land, the Battle of Warsaw, the Battle of Gorlice, the members of the legions fighting in the context of what was happening in the Eastern Front, because it would be hard to speak of the fate of Polish lands if you did account for what was happening on the fronts. Well, there was also this unity history, civilizational history that changes, that the war brought, the destruction that war, in other words, Poland, this part of Europe, much like Serbia, were most destroyed. The 70 kilometers away from the border, destruction was very deep there in Poland. This destruction covered 2/3 of the future Polish territory. So we were industrial production in 2019 in central Poland was, mind you, just 15% of the pre-2013 production, and the Republic that had no capital resources found it difficult to convince the world that it had its place under the sun here in Central Europe, and it found it difficult to rebuild itself. It had to have such difficulties. There was no other way out, but in that history we have, there was space for human activity, human behavior, the attitude of a regular human, this phenomenon of gossip when the military censorship was working, people were gossiping. Gossip also played fantastic communication systems. It was destroying old communities that were conducting war. There was also information about espionage. People, millions of armies and millions of civilians. You can speak of two parallel armies, the civilian and the military. If there is war, war comes with demoralization. Everyone does. And this one was no exception. Now, the scale of this demoralization is important, and then its impact will be visible in the following years. Now, the fate of women, the activation of women, is worth reminding that women received full civil rights earlier than the decision of the US Senate about giving the full suffrage rights to American women. Polish women received full citizens' right before the Brits, before the French, long before the French, who got them in 1944 only. So that is a phenomenon of that mobilization of women, which is connected to that cult of the Polish mother, a woman who is concentrated on her family, not only the small one, but also the big one, the Polish one, that's just to survive, to create an opportunity for becoming independent, for making the country independent, and that opportunity arrived. This book discusses also the black market. That's absolutely unbelievable. That was Europe's best organized black market. There would be no efficient polls during the Second World War if not the experiences of the black market, of the people who were really doing shady businesses, earning on various margins, but they were the ones who made it possible to have access to goods that were available only with ratio cards. Some products were hard to come by, and towards the end of the war, some of them were absolutely unobtainable. But let's get back to the international history. As you said, Professor, there were dreamers in Europe, not only in Poland. The nations that dreamt about their independent states were individual. But late in the 1980s, the Grand Chancellor of Germany, Otto von Bismarck, warned Germans, so a European power, against the not cause a conflict between powers, will give an opportunity for the pygmies of Europe, pygmies. So those short people living in Congo today became a particular symbol of aspiration to be a sovereign in their space. And that meant the destruction of the Viennese Europe, the one that was born in 1815. Also, the concept of destruction of the powers of Europe, because these were the powers in Europe that believed that they write history. Others were just to play as they wrote that history. Now, was Bismarck right? Yes, he was right, because he saw the central states that they are balanced by the others. Already then, you could see that neither of them has any upper hand. And the same thing was visible in 1914. And that was this opportunity for the dreamers, for the romantics like Józef Piłsudski, who said that Poland will come to be. But how many of them were there? They were individuals. There were 10 nations in Austro-Hungary. Apart from the Germans and Austrians and Hungarians, the ruling ones, there were 8 more. Their number did not include anyone other than Piłsudski and his friends, no dreamers who would see an opportunity to break that arrangement, break that system. And if war continued as it was supposed to be for 4 or 5 months, nothing would really happen. Professor Chodakiewicz would not be quoting those wise quotations of his because there would be a different Europe. So that war brought good to the nations that dreamt about independence, and it had to last longer so that the powers fighting each other destroyed one another. They were fighting and also destroying the territories that they were fighting in, so the territory of the Polish state. It is obvious, it goes without saying, that the partitioning powers, Austro-Hungary, Russia, Germany, did not intend any changes in the Polish national being. At most they could do was to articulate certain dreams, just like the royalists in Austria, who hoped that if Austria and Germany win Russia, there would be Austro-Hungary Poland, of course, without the German partition. And that's just it. The nationalists with Dmowski did not speak of independence in 1914. They would only do it in the second half of the war, when real opportunities for changing the system would come. And now come year 2015, 2016, and finally, in this Europe of ours, the victory belongs to the central states, Germany, first of all, and of course, Austrians by their side. They reach deeply into the Eastern Europe, capturing territories that belong to Russia, following the former lands of Poland, Lithuania. That's when the idea was born, a German idea, what to do about those former Russian lands. To occupy, well, not quite efficient. And then came the idea to create a group of states that was called Mitteleuropa in 1915. But the idea that was forced then was something more than Mitteleuropa, because as the German chancellor called it, it was the German Union to reach from Helsingers, that's today's Helsinki, where they wanted a state with German dynasty, Ukraine, Lithuania, and the Kingdom of Poland. That was to be the first state in this new Europe. Everywhere there was one time zone. There were no time zones because that was supposed to help management of it all from Berlin. In the West, Berlin intended to break Belgium, and the Flemish state was to be established with the capital in Ghent. There were those patriots, Flemish patriots, who were ready to break that part of Europe too. Well, the history went along different routes, and a significant, if not decisive, role was here that of the United States. What name do we hear here? Wilson, who has a significant place in the Polish history, also because his friend was this genius virtuoso of Poland, Jan Paderewski, whose concerts in Carnegie Hall, for example, attracted 15,000 people. The money from the concert went to the establishment of the Polish army in France, which was there to fight side by side with the French, the British, and the Americans. Americans, well, it's quite known that since the spring of 17, we're in the state of war, and that was what made it possible to set up the army. Where did the soldiers come? Thanks to the arrangement of Paderewski and Wilson, they were recruited from the US. Originally, it was to be called Kościuszko's army. Well, remember that in these days, we unveiled the Kościuszko's monument in New York, perfect place. Another great Polish and American hero. Here, this history, Polish and American, began to be tangled,
Paderewski postawił na dobrego konia.
interwoven. Paderewski set for the good horse, if we speak gambling language. He earmarked his money for supporting Wilson, and that was a good choice. As American tradition had it, well, some payback was required for the sponsor. And this famous American address of Wilson to the US Congress from January 1918 would be different if not for the cooperation of those two eminent figures, an artist, a politician visionary with a politician idealist. Let's see that in the 14 points of Wilson's address, only 1/13 speaks of the establishment of the new country, that's Poland. Wilson did not give a perspective to other nations living in the western borders of Russia, in Austria, Czechs, Serbs, Croats, because to the end, Americans believed that Austro-Hungary, until nearly the end, they believed that Europe needs Austro-Hungary. Wilson was convinced that it is so, like the British. It was only in the autumn that they agreed. The French agreed to the destruction of the old world because this world was crumbling. The Austro-Hungarian army destroyed itself. The state was falling under its own burden. Austria was not ready, like Russia, for such a war. Austria also was threatened with a revolution, and Russia, of course, we know that.
In autumn 1918, November Revolution broke out in Germany. So this wrath of the people was being turned against their own states, their own Baltic peoples, the Lithuanians, Finns, Lithuanians. They woke up. They understood that such an opportunity shall not be there any soon. So they had to take matters in their own hands in order to win. But a little bit in the remit of the polemics with Professor Chodakevich, as far as the legions are concerned, yes, there were not numerals, but in 1916 in the Volhynia, the legions were controlling 60 kilometers of land. That was a lot, 60 kilometers. And in the opinion of Germans and of the Germans and the Austrians, they were saying there was no other better military formation than the legions. The legionaries were the best formation, military formation, because they were volunteers. They were not peasants who had to switch from plow to sword, or, for instance, soldiers in the Russian army who were illiterate. No, it was, and they didn't see any point in fighting. But as far as the legionaries are concerned, they were thinking about independence. They were fighting for Poland. And they were saying, we're fighting for Poland, and that is why we fight well. And I have been perusing their orders, marching orders, and in there you can read that Russian commanders, the Russians, faced the refusal to follow orders when a division was to attack the legionaries or the legion's brigades. So they were very well trained, and the Germans also knew that. And there wouldn't be the Act of Two Caesars on the 5th of November, still 1916, established the Polish kingdom. So, as you can see, that was the beginning of regaining independence in 1916 and 1917. The National Polish Committee in Paris was recognized as a representative of Poland, not immediately, and also that National Committee in Moscow could finally issue passports, Polish passports, although Poland was not yet there, and even there was a possibility of raising funds in Morgan's bank in order to maintain the army and the committee. So if the money is being borrowed from the Americans, that means that Americans are definitely backing those whom they borrow the money. This is it. Thank you very much. Professor, thank you very much. It is over to you, Professor.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. No disrespect meant for the legionaries. I have no doubt that they fought bravely. Just a couple of comments, or actually a quote, especially for you. The Austrians do not cease to behave like swine. Their troops do not hold any longer, as the sad events of the last days have proved. My eye turns again to the Poles. The Pole is a good soldier. If Austria fails, then we must provide new forces for ourselves. Let us create a Grand Duchy of Poland with Warsaw and Lublin, and then a Polish army under German command. So General Erich Ludendorff, in a letter to Arthur Zimmermann of July 17th, 1916. I have no doubt about it, but what are we talking about? Please, don't let me be raining on your parade, but we're talking about a brigade at a time when there were millions of people clashing both on the Western and Eastern and Southern Front. A brigade. Moreover, more of us, Americans of Polish...
Trzy brygady.
American...
Trzy brygady.
Okay,
There were three brigades. There were three brigades.
Three brigades, so what, 5,000
Trzy
people?
brygady? Nie, trzy brygady wartości 3 dywizji.
Well,
Yes, but three
I'm not
brigades of
talking
the
about the
value of
relative value.
5 divisions.
How many people? How many people?
Uwaga.
How many
Well-
people? Just how many people? Very simple question.
Już nad tym...
Let me answer. I will give you an answer. So where Brusilov, 300 kilometers, 60 kilometers. So that was the stretch of land where Brusilov attacked. And so that was the Russian counteroffensive, the largest one. And the Russians had great hopes that on that they had 200,000 soldiers, German, Austrian, and Polish soldiers. And of that, 25,000 were legionaries. But they had immense quality, uncomparable quality when compared with German or Austrian soldiers. And when Austrians were the first to run away as soon as they heard the Russians were attacking.
Professor Falba, I agree. I love them. But I have to tell you, we 75,000 Americans of Polish descent signed up to fight. Almost 30,000 appeared across the ocean. So more Americans of Polish extraction showed up to fight. And were they not brave? Maybe they didn't call themselves First Brigade, but they were just the same. They were extremely brave. That's not my point. My point is that because there was no Polish state, there were so few. I am not questioning their honor, valor, and bravery. I've just read General Erich Ludendorff to that effect. They were fabulous. They were fantastic, but they were too few. They were too few. It does not in any way reflect badly on them. They were just too few. So they didn't matter. They mattered only so far as the myth, the legend, and the cadres, persevered until 1918 so they could move into action when everything fell apart. But otherwise, they would have been discarded like Napoleon's legions. So this was a calculated gamble on the part of Piłsudski and his one brigade, and then the two brigades which were not Piłsudskiite brigades. So it was a calculated gamble, just like the Pulaski Legion gambled that maybe something can be done for Poland under the Tsar. I am not questioning the bravery of the legionaries. I'm just saying when you look at the wrestling of the giants with their multi-million men armies, the Polish force was fabulous, but it was tiny. And its role was myth and cadres for 1918, because the cookie crumbled the way it did in Prussia, Austria, and Russia. So fabulous. That means in politics, you have to persevere no matter what, because you can only prognosticate possible outcomes, but you're not God, so you do not know what exactly is going to happen. After all, the legionaries, Polish legionaries who fought for France and Napoleon, got the short end of the stick because Napoleon, when he was done with them, shipped them off to Haiti. And that was it. I don't imagine that if the empires had stood their ground, not fallen apart, anybody in Austria would be celebrating Piłsudski. He'd be considered a dangerous socialist. And Dmowski would be considered a traitor to the Tsar for having traveled to the West. So that's all I'm saying. I'm not belittling, I'm not disparaging the Polish effort, but it's very good for the Poles at home to learn how little they could do, and they did everything like fiends and heroes under the circumstances, and how little and how poorly they are regarded outside, in particular by the likes of David Lloyd George. There was a reason for it, namely empires love empires. They have no time for the little ones. And here is another question. I have no problem with the Commonwealth, not only because my roots are from the Commonwealth. The Chodakiewiczes were in Województwo Mścisławskie, so even personal roots. My father was born in Wilno. My foster father and my foster mother were both born in Lwów. But that doesn't matter. Poland was a historical nation which was robbed of its state and destroyed. However, the Poland has not perished. Yet for other non-historic nations, it was a new beginning. So it is a legitimate question. When do we stop? Do the Vlachs deserve their own nation? By President Wilson's reckoning, yes. And you know what? The enemies of Poland in the Allied camp used Wilson's imagination of a state sovereignty of little nations to undercut Poland, because the Poles thought they were resurrecting the Commonwealth. Nobody among the Endeks thought about an ethno-nationalist, folk-nationalist state. They all thought Rzeczpospolita. But everybody else among the non-historic, among the folk-nationalist peasant nations thought that Poland was an abomination and it should be destroyed, and there should be ethno-Ukraine, ethno-Belarus, and ethno-Lithuania. So that is a big difference. So in other words, Wilsonian have more questions, especially about the black market, because that is fascinating. That is very fascinating. Dr. Markowski, would you mind? Your turn.
Oczywiście, bardzo dziękuję, panie profesorze.
Obviously, thank you very much, Professor. Thank you very much. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very glad to be able to meet you, and I'm very happy that you professors used that phrase and you returned to that phrase repeatedly during this discussion as the romantic nationalism and the dreamers, because in the case of my book, I believe that the dreamers are the ones I could mention from the start to the end, meaning here both the Polish and Ukrainian patriots who wanted to see Lwów or Lviv in their country. Going from that macro scale that you gentlemen discussed so interestingly, and we could go to the perhaps not micro scale, but to local, which was smaller and closed, but only in theory, to a single city from which that fire later also infected far more broad, far more comprehensive lands. Now, a look at what happened here from the perspective of a Polish historian was a particular link in the chain which you indirectly mentioned. This chain of events of pro-independence steps, which was connected also to the time of national uprisings, the outbreak of this legionary myth. And I would not depreciate its importance because legions were a return here. Not only they were an actual return to the idea of carrying out, of creating the Polish army with Polish banners, perhaps not yet Poland being one of the goals finished, but that was where you built the cadre, the officer echelons for the Polish army. And Poland seemed to be coming out of the take it over for Polish. And Ukrainian uprising first, and Poles were surprised to the degree that they were unprepared. I dare say that only by a the belonging 1918 could not be so gloriously remembered if not for the launching of this gene of freedom.
Że o Lwów trzeba było walczyć.
Word. Just the fact that you had to fight for Lwów became a factor strongly bringing together those communities. Legible, both in the memory of blood. There were battles in the street, actual battles that made Lwów the forepost of the Poland being when even though the Poland East was Poland was not yet there, it was opening, but that was when the Polish and radio stations received information. It was carried away by the scouts. They
opinię publiczną.
opinion, and it quickly reached to Kraków, soon afterwards to Warsaw, that Poles in Lwów fight, that Poles need assistance. And I could see here a certain element of the spirit of one of the national uprisings. The fight for Lwów will soon turn into something that would also end the way. Still, there were no such borders. So those events forced that these groups, starting from the left, going further to the right, they had to work out a position towards what was happening in Lwów. And they knew particularly well that it really depends, what happens will strongly influence how Poland is going to be seen in the victorial camp. All these events make pressure on the developing state authorities, and that pressure means that the authorities must take steps to solve the issue of belonging, the issue of belonging of Lwów, of Volhynia and Eastern Galicia to the Polish state being born, being developed. At the same time, we have here a particular political dimension that from the very first days of the Polish uprising in Lwów has been present. It has been present also there more extensively. Namely, the question was how to present to the victorious powers who are just finishing to win the war, how to do it so that they are favorable. All the city tissue was captured from Russians. There was a French woman, which also was a certain explanation for his taking sides and favoring one side, one party. Initially, the Ukrainian party was wondering whether to treat them officially or not, and it turned out that William received recommendations from his the authors of his mission. His short mission, just a few days, contributed to the fact that when the Ukrainian party began to take the upper hand fighting for the city, that they agreed to us, and that truce ended in Lwów being reached by the Polish diplomats from. Then there was a mission of Mr. Wade, which created a far more lasting foundation for political solution of the problem.
Później jest jeszcze ta misja generała Józefa Bertelemiego, która przywozi ze sobą nie tylko
brought not only diplomats and the military, but it also had a whole detachment with ammunition and military supplies for the fighting Polish troops. We can also say that in the designed demarcation lines, Lwów was only and solely on the Polish side. This was also influenced by the financial committee operating abroad, the financial commission of the Polish committee acting in France. it proved the oil industry hub. All the branches of politics were present from the very first weeks of the fight for Lwów, and the Ukrainian party was busy with bringing together the central Ukraine and West Ukrainian state, and to a certain extent it didn't have the tools that the Polish party had to undertake equally seriously steps on the international stage to win the recognition for its party. Gradually, the situation of the Ukrainian party was deteriorating when it turned out that Ukrainian politicians were incapable of sitting to the negotiation table. They were incapable of becoming part of a compromise. The sun was not only to be the dividing line, then during the peace conference to expand their state of possession and also include, for example, Lemkowina and reach far, far beyond the line of the Sun River. When it comes to the political dimension, I just wanted to signal a handful of those few basic elements of this conflict that was slowly turning into an international one, and that was turning into something that needed the determination of a lasting post-war order. And I believe that you often don't underestimate the propaganda on both sides. You underestimate the significance of how very strongly the attitudes of individual societies were influenced by the press. The Polish version of this propaganda, the Polish party from the beginning wanted to emphasize the historical ties, the historical connections, to refer to the heritage of the Commonwealth that has been mentioned here before. At the same time, emphasizing that this organism that was broken apart unjustly, as claimed at the time, could return to the maps of Europe. It is emphasized that the people of Lwów are mostly Polish, and Poles are to be the decided majority of the cities in Eastern Galicia. At the same time, more and more often, information about the actual and alleged crimes of the Ukrainian party are emphasized. There was a powerful argument of the Polish party that there was an alleged Ukrainian-German alliance, although there was none, and Poles tried to emphasize in the propaganda that the capture of Lwów by Ukrainians was possible only due to this alleged cooperation with the Austrians. This was a way of compromising the position of the Ukrainians on the international stage. At the same time, the Polish party tried to tune down the importance of information about the Lviv pogrom, 22nd, 24th November 1918, after whole of Lwów was already taken from the Ukrainian hands. To compare, the Ukrainian propaganda tried to present Poles in the West as the occupiers of the ethnically Ukrainian land, tried to present them as an insignificant minority, trying to oppose the idea of self-government, that they were trying to take over that area. It was also stated that if the Ukrainian state would develop, it would be a republic and would give Poles the rights that are due to every democratic republic, so that they wouldn't have to be worried about what was happening there. And they also emphasized the information about the actual and alleged crimes What comes to the fore in the Ukrainian propaganda is the Lwów pogrom, where the number of victims is multiplied and information is shared about the death of even 8,000 people, which we know to be absolute rubbish, because there were probably 79 Jewish people who were killed at the time in Lwów. And the Polish party was much better prepared politically to the confrontation about the belonging of Lwów. Propaganda-wise, Poles were also capable of deciding this controversy for their benefit, among others, thanks to the friendship of those allied military, those who participated in the missions. Also thanks to the loyal attitude of some Jewish people, including Dr. Tobias Ashkenazi, who, as a representative of Lwów Jews, recognized the events that took place in Lwów, the November pogrom, an internal Polish question. The impact of Ukrainian propaganda was limited.
Mniejszy zasięg informacyjny.
Due to a much smaller information scope, and it was also due to the position of the Western states. So this is it as far as my introduction is concerned, and I will be happy to take part in the discussion where we can address many more topics. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. I really enjoy micro-studies. I think first we should concentrate on micro-studies before we pontificate on general topics. Always Hitler's mustache is the favorite approach of historians. Include a micro-study in their research, in their career. As far as Battle for Lwów is concerned, I'm sorry to say that in the West, the only thing that anybody who knows anything, those are very few people in the West, the only thing that exists is really the pogrom of Lwów. And as Dr. Markowski said, the estimates vary widely. There is no good case study of it. Everybody essentially repeats propaganda, and there is very little balance, very little scholarship. And lately, it has become contextualized in overall violence in the borderlands and in the Kingdom of Poland as somehow a prelude to the Holocaust. It hasn't happened. It hasn't happened overnight, but people like Ezra Mendelssohn, William W. Hagen, Carol Fink, Ilya Pritzel, Theodor Weeks, Mark von Hagen, Eva Rader see so-called Polish pogroms as a wave of violence that served as a harbinger of the Holocaust to come. In other words, Central and Eastern Europe, Intermarium, and the Poles in particular seem to be the incubator of what eventually the Germans, I'm sorry, Nazis, because there were no Germans, of course, realized as the Holocaust. For instance, William W. Hagen, my favorite, commented on this. The Poles had acted from anti-communist hysteria and nationalistic identification of the Jews with the Bolsheviks, inspired by the hateful epithet Żydokomuna. That sort of cliche is applied to everything and really overshadows any attempts by Professor Falba to write about the heroism of the legions, or attempts of Professor Novak to explain the international context and the treason of the West, because after all, if those were anti-Semites who were preparing the Holocaust, they well deserved Bolshevik occupation. And Mr. Markowski's efforts now in English, just like Professor Falba's, will be a trickle of an antidote to this toxic endeavor to see the Holocaust retroactively as incubating in the wake of World War I in Poland and among its neighbors. The Poles tend to get the short end of the stick. People like a scholar who works in Canada, Piotr Wróbel, saw Lwów and Pinsk as one of the series of pogroms, but also as a prelude to the Holocaust. He fantasized gloomily that had the Germans not started World War II, and a local war would have broken out without the participation of Berlin, the states and people of the Intermarium of Central and Eastern Europe would have carried out the Holocaust by themselves. There are others who have developed this thesis, for instance, Jeffrey Weidlinger, who believes that the Holocaust would have been impossible without the civil war in Russia, which included a war for independence of Poland, because those conflicts allegedly normalized anti-Jewish violence, and they helped helped the Christian neighbors to get used to murdering their Jewish neighbors. So, aside from Weidlinger, there is Ian Burtzlaff, who treats the period of 1914 and 1945 as a theological and deterministic process stemming from itself. So the pogroms were, including the pogrom in Lwów, were an initiation before the Shoah. This is called collectively the new school, the new historical school of the Holocaust. It's high time the folks in Poland, scholars, found out about it, because that's what's been going on. I'll stress again, Piotr Wróbel wrote, it is likely that if a war had started in Central and Eastern Europe in the 30s or 40s without German participation, large-scale anti-Jewish violence would have taken place there anyway. There probably would have been no final solution, and the survival rate would have been much higher than after the Holocaust. However, some other part of the local Jewry would have been murdered instead. This is trivializing the Holocaust, but that's standard now. Here's even the great Richard Pipes, whom I otherwise really like and admire. He wrote, in every respect, except in the absence of a central organization to organize the slaughter, the pogroms of 1919 were a prelude to and a rehearsal for the Holocaust. Jonathan D. Smelly pointed out that Pipes was wrong. Why? After all, what surely marks the Holocaust as unique was the very presence of the very central organization. Also, pogroms were not at all limited to the Intermarium in the Civil War period. There were pogroms everywhere. To be fair, Richard Pipes is rather elastic, flexible in applying the term the Holocaust to all mega murders. He, for instance, at one point, he equated National Socialism and International Socialism, so Nazism and communism, because in another monograph of his, he wrote about the Stalinist and Nazi Holocausts and the Communist Holocaust. Although he qualifies it, he says Lenin murdered tens or hundreds of thousands, but his successors, Hitler and Stalin, millions. So I wouldn't be too harsh on Richard Pipes. He was just sloppy at one point, and this problem requires discipline, like Dr. Markowski has presented. So my question is this, Dr. Markowski, are you aware of anything that I'm saying? I can continue ad nauseam giving you names. Have you ever heard about any of those names? They are the scholars who determine how the tale of the Polish struggle for independence is told. And right now it is told as if the Poles were Einsatzgruppen of the SS. So what say you?
Dziękuję bardzo, panie profesorze.
Thank you, Professor, for this question. I do not know to what extent my opinion could change anything whatsoever, but I dare say that a path, a way to fight such misleading thoughts, because here, Professor, you mentioned here a whole link of ideas that are there to change the global opinion, and in fact it was violence. To what extent was it really an introduction of preludium to the Holocaust? And the best way to oppose this point of view and to pinpoint them being improper is to actually present the events as they were. We needed to present information about the true motivation of those who committed crimes, and we need to speak of real numbers, and we need to speak about the motivating factors. And of course, we cannot possibly justify those who committed such crimes. My book is quite determinedly or even radically in conflict with another book, which is not a historical book, but quite a popular book by Grzegorz Gałden. And I think that Mr. Gałden is very much a vociferous voice in this group of authors that you were kind to mention, because if we compare, for instance, 1918 to 1941, what Gałden wrote about and what was happening in Lwów at that time, then undoubtedly what he writes is an offense to the memory of the victims of the Holocaust. How come one can compare the tragic and this horrible pogrom that was executed by marauders and Polish soldiers in 1918? How on earth could that be compared? And of course, we know that pogrom was was a terrible crime. But how can we compare the suffering and death of 70 people who died then with the thousands who died later on? And for instance, we need to remember about the context. And in this case, particular case, we may speak about the instrumentalization and of creating a conflict around the history we're trying to study.
Thank you. I agree with you, and I think Grzegorz Gałden is just a pale reflection of what's going on here in the United States. So in a way, it's it's a cultural translation, if not plagiarism, of the opinions fluctuating here. What most of you in Poland don't appreciate is that the intellectual climate has shifted from logocentrism and empiricism to postmodernism. That means, and you've already been given a treatment as far as that is concerned, that is a postmodernism posits that there is no truth, so anything goes. And you take those people seriously. You've already experienced it on your skin when Professor Gross wrote his shocking postmodernist story that most Polish intellectuals took seriously. That was not a case study. It was just an infusion, a figment of one's imagination, which temporarily becomes the truth revealed. And so is the story of Lwów. So I agree with you. The only remedy is keep researching, like Professor Falba and yourself, keep writing a classical, logocentric, empiricist studies, and do so in English. I know that there's a lot of stuff to be done in Polish, so you do it, but I commend the Kurtyki Foundation for translating it. I wish I could buy it on American Amazon. I can't. It doesn't list. So I hope you will be able to Zoom or come over to our school and talk about those things in English. Because it's absolutely necessary to hear a narrative that's classical history with all the methodological tools of the trade, as opposed to the shocking stuff. And you guys take them seriously like scholars. They are not scholars in a classical sense. They are a new school where facts don't matter, facts don't exist. And as I said, for the first time, you were massively subjected to it in the case of Jedwabne. Now you will have Lwów, now you will have everything else. And very soon, there will be very many people emulating this in Poland. So that guy who wrote about Lwów, that's just a harbinger of the things to come. Anything can be treated that way. And there isn't much what you can do against it because there's freedom of speech. Of course, it's annoying that they pretend to be scholars. So what you have to do is continue case studies, continue synthetic works when it's warranted, and have them ready in English, because Poland hardly exists in scholarship. And when it does in the grotesque form that I have just quoted. And if you want me to, I can continue, but you would just become annoyed. You would be annoyed. You wouldn't want to believe me, because that's the default that hardly anybody believes in any of this, because it boggles the mind. It boggles the mind. And Lwów is probably one place where everybody feels entitled to write about. For instance, Jochen Böhler in Civil War in Central Europe, 1918-1921, the reconstruction of Poland, writes on page 77, one of the worst anti-Jewish pogroms committed by Polish soldiers in early independence. That was Lwów. Philip Ter in War versus Peace. The Poles staged a pogrom. Christopher Mick in Lemberg, Lwów, writes about a pogrom that stems from anti-Semitism. obsessively. Obsessively. Well, there is hope. There is hope if your scholarship reveals itself in the English language. Otherwise, you will just be talking to yourselves. And I'm not just saying to a few scholars that are like Professor Falba or Professor Nowak or Henio Głębocki, so a charmed circle of specialists. I'm talking about a dwindling legion, or Professor Falba would like it, a dwindling brigade of legionaries who remember Polish history. And the other guys will take over the popular imagination and look at their proposition. You don't have to study anything. All you have to have is effusions and feelings. You don't have to bother to go to the archives. Or when you go to the archives, just be ready to spew your hatred in this postmodernist vein. This is the spirit of the times. That's what flies. That is what's going to be remembered, at least for now, until the fashion of the day changes. Well, I have news. If you stick to logocentrism and empiricism, anything is possible to save as far as history. And if it's not you, then it'll be your children or grandchildren that will pick up the story where you left it, but at least it will be ready. Remember when Jedwabne broke out? The story of Jedwabne, nobody knew about anything, just like about Lwów. Nobody knew about anything because micro studies are the keys, indispensable to synthesize international history. Okay, that's my rave for today. Thank you. If there are any questions, please let us know and ask Professor Falba and Dr. Markowski. That would be very nice. No questions that I would like to ask Professor Falba about black marketeering and corruption. Because I know he's written a book about corruption in the Russian Empire, which is very amusing. But anyway, how do you know, this is my question, that the Poles or the people of Poland, obviously not only Poles, but other inhabitants, including Jewish denizens of the Polish lands, how do you know they were the best at black marketeering? Do you know any studies comparable to yours in the West?
Czy są znane na Zachodzie? Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you very much for that question. Are they known in the West? No, they are not known, but there are studies known on the black market in the period of German occupation during the Second World War. And that research was published in English and in German. Now, black market was mentioned in the case of the works that were written in the US and the UK. There were works, as far as I remember, German ones and Austrian ones concerning, and German ones concerning perhaps not as much the black market, but the impact of this ratio system, because we know that Germans and Austrians introduced this way of rationing goods. There were bonds and there were also requisitions of goods, but requisition meant that there was a social resistance, and the resistance of the community took the shape of a parallel market, that is a market that operated in parallel and as an alternative to the official one. Interestingly, we discuss here Polish-Jewish conflicts, but the development of the market known as black, the market that was an alternative in parallel, its efficiency is something that we owe to the perfect cooperation of groups, often criminal groups, that was quite necessary for that market to develop. You needed to break the law of the occupant, German, Austrian, earlier Russian as well. Corruption was perhaps secondary or even tertiary, and still it wasn't immaterial either. But the cooperation of the two societies, namely Polish and Christian. In Polish, there were, following Yiddish, such words as melina, ksywka, szmugiel, and these are the words that also are present in the language used later during the Second World War. Poles took over goods that belonged to the partitioning powers, to the occupant later, and these goods were marketed by those who were efficient in that. That's the Jews. In the area of developing the black market, without the combination of the Christian and Jewish competences, that would be impossible. But that is the only area that operated so well. Speaking of other questions, those relations would be not that good, but towards the end of the war, they were actually bad. So that did happen, and thanks to this, people could make their ends meet, because if not for that, those ratio cards which guaranteed 30–40% of your calorie intake, they guaranteed the survival for 3 months. Okay, what then? What then? The second or the third question connected there too is the peasant tradition of finding food out of your own farm, at the neighbors, but also in the environment, in the pasture, in the forest. And those herbs, those roots, those stems were also introduced to the parallel market, combined with other products, and sold as bread. Bread that consisted not only of flour. Flour was but one of the elements, one of the constituents, because that flour was simply in short supply. Let's remember that the famous Peace of Brest, which the central state conducted with Ukraine in March 1918, was a truce, a peace that was based on sugar, cattle, and grains that and tobacco that moved from the markets of Ukraine to the markets of central states. So the situation was dramatic, and Polish or Jewish smugglers, they had already before smuggled grain and products via Ukraine, but also from the countries over the Black Sea. After all, even caviar from Astrakhan reached the black market in the 1917 and 18. Luxury goods, chocolate, coffee, cocoa, all that was there thanks to that smuggling international. That's a passionate piece of history. And yes, Professor, you're right. For that to be investigated, you need far-going research. But speaking of our specialty in the black market, I'm not saying we're champions and that we cannot be second to any other, but we know how to teach others, certainly. So thank you very much.
Thank you. This is really fabulous. And I'm learning a lot. I've done myself 3 case studies. 2 are published, one on Naishishki outside of Vilna, and this was mostly about the Second World War, and so was Jedwabne outside of Łomża. We also have, me and Mariusz Bechta have a case study of Pinsk during World War I and its aftermath. So it's almost ready. It's a mammoth tome, over 1,000 pages. We're finishing it up. But I'm wondering how fabulous it would be to look in a comparativist perspective at studies of various or synthesized studies of various towns during World War I did that for my Pinsk. So I looked at monographs of London, Paris, Berlin, as well as Warsaw, Lwów, Kraków, and Vilna. As far as medium-sized towns, there's the Flemish Brugia, German Freiburg, I think in Polish it's Fryburg Brzygowiski, and Riga, the Baltics. So Christopher Mick wrote about it in Kriegersfahndungen in einer multiethnischen Stadt Lemberg, 1914-1947, which is not precisely World War I, but it has enough fodder for thought. Marta Polsakiewicz published Warschau im Ersten Weltkrieg, deutsche Besatzungspolitik zwischen kultureller Autonomie und wirtschaftlicher Ausbeuten. And finally, Robert Blobaum, A Minor Apocalypse, Warsaw during the First World War. It's a fine book. I know that Polish scholars such as Bartosz Ogórek and who wrote about Krakow, and Andrzej Puksto, who wrote, there is a little bit more about Vilna and Theodor R. Weeks, Vilnius Between Nations, 1795-2000. The chapter on World War I doesn't do it justice. However, he does note that the Poles were the first ones to react negatively to the German occupation, and then Jews, and finally the Lithuanians. There is further an attempt to discuss Vilna in a liberal ethno-nationalist revisionist vein by Laimon Briedis, Vilnius, City of Strangers. There has been a symposium on Polish cities occupied in World War I in the Polish Review by Robert Blobaum, Nathaniel Wood, Drew Burks, and that would include Lemberg or Lwów. John Czaplicka wrote about Lviv, a city in the cross currents of European culture. It's good to look at Mark Hutley's Riga at War, 1914-1919. And as far as Western European experiences, that would be Jay Winter and Jean-Louis Robert, Capital Cities at War, Paris, London, Berlin. Maureen Healy wrote a fine monograph on Vienna and the fall of the Habsburg Empire, total war and everyday life in World War I. Just like Professor Chwalba, she concentrates a lot on social history. Social history has been riding high for some time now in the West. Roger Chickering, The Great War and Urban Life in Germany, Freiburg, is a solid monograph. Sophie de Driver wrote Bastion, Occupied Bourgeois in the First World War. There are 2 very incisive essays in Hugh Cecil and Peter H. Little's Facing Armageddon, the First World War Experienced by Mark Derez, The Flames of Louvain, The Experience of an Academic Community, and Annette Becker, Life in Occupied Zone, Lille, Roubaix, and Tourcoing. More broadly about the civilian population, there are the studies of John Horn, State Society. He edited it, State Society and Mobilization in Europe During the First World War. Tammy Proctor, Civilians in the World at War, 1914-1918. And in France and Belgium, Helen McPhail, The Long Silence, Civilian Life under the German occupation of Northern France. 21 years ago, she had endeavored to do what Professor Falba and Dr. D did for Lwów, essentially. There is a fine monograph by Annette Becker, Les cicatrices fugées France et Belgique occupées, so on the French and Belgian lands occupied by the Germans. Sophie Deschep-Driver also wrote about Belgium occupied in World War I. Reinhold Zilch compared, a very useful comparison, of Okkupation und Währung im Ersten Weltkrieg, die deutsche Besatzungspolitik in Belgien und Russisch-Polen. So a comparison between the Kingdom of Poland, more or less, and adjacent lands, and Belgium. You should also review and incorporate into your studies, if I may suggest so, Facing Total War by Jürgen Kotzka, Facing Total War, German Society, 1914-1918. And Rudolf Kuchera, Rationed Life, Science, Everyday Life, and Working Class Politics in the Bohemian Lands, 1914-1918. It's all extremely fascinating. It's all extremely new, but you just don't think about it and you don't hear about it because it doesn't get any coverage, unlike popular coverage, unlike the so-called new school of the Holocaust. So I cannot wait to see and read Polish scholars, conversant in those narratives who do exist in the West, and referring to them, embracing them, debunking them, discussing with them. That is the only way for Poland to be noticed on the map, on the intellectual map, despite all the unfairness that Dr. Markowski knows about. And Professor Falba, of course. I think Professor Falba just does his thing. He's unfazed. He knows his stuff. And that's fabulous for me. And once again, I welcome both of your monographs in English. This is fabulous. They should be talked about, reviewed, etc. in the English language. Not that I don't care what you guys do in Poland, in Polish, but the audience is global. I remember when I had a query from Japan, why didn't the Poles review this or that book? And I said, that's because they probably don't know that it even exists. But it's a horrible book about Poland. I said, I'll repeat again, they probably don't know it exists. So finally, I ended up sending a review to Arcana because I'm always baffled, or I used to be baffled. Why don't you guys laugh those phonies, not scholars, but phonies out of court? These guys have nothing on you. You research, you hit the archives, but you are silent on them. Well, you do your stuff, but you also should review those books, both in Polish and in English. It's pathetic. It's pathetic to see people who attempt to talk about you over your heads. when they have no idea about any of the stuff you deal with. But to be able to put your point across, it has to be English. Copernicus wrote De Revolutionibus Orbium Celestium in Latin. Had he written in Polish, that would have been the audience of one. In our life here, we who can't go and research in Poland so easily. I mean, I do go, as you know, and Russia, etc. I no longer can go to Russia. I won't get a visa. But you be present is in the English language. Thank you. I think that's all we have. And
Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you very much.
Świetny komentarz, także dziękuję.
Great commentary. Thank you very much. If just one more comment on my side, Professor mentioned on the sidelines about the for Central Eastern European Studies and Studies of Poland, and in fact, the history of Poland is fairly well known in Japan, and I know that they have 4 or 5 good specialize in Polish history system every now and then in Krakow, and then Taiwan recently have made quite a headway. Thank you. Over to you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Indeed, we can see that perhaps we will need to Asian countries, economic future of the world lies, and to a major extent, we are developing our relations with Eastern Asian countries, so we're going to follow on that. But as far as your conclusion is concerned, to publish in the English language, that hence this is the idea of our foundation, and our idea is to support the distribution of those books that are already published in the Polish language to promote their publications all over the world. But just one more point, it's not enough to publish in English, and our research shows that it's important to provide for proper distribution, but here published the central publishing house of the IN Poland, then they are shelved in they're shelved may in theory be purchased on the online shop of the EPN, but it's about the distribution. Here we cooperate with the international publishing houses, with better luck. In this case, we cooperate with the global distribution network, and before that, we cooperated with Caroline Press Papers. You're showing something. Here, I will give the floor over to you. Just a minute.
Called Disinformation by Natalie Grant. Natalie Grant is a pseudonym. She was the wife of the head of Poland's Dwójka against the Soviets, whose pseudonym was Richard Braga. They were friends of my family. So when she died, I got the book, Leopolis Press, of the Kościuszko chair. That means there are ways to publish things in the United States. I just have to fundraise. That's all. Because if you publish it in Poland in English and it stays in Poland, that it's not enough. It has to go on Amazon and it has to move around. It has to be in university catalogs. That means you have to send a few to a couple of people. It should be reviewed. when you write something, it should be reviewed. Anyway, so this is a complicated process. At any rate, I just wanted to say goodbye because I have to run duty calls, and I thank you very much for the possibility to chew your ears off and to tell you wild stories about the Wild East. Professor Falba, Dr. Markowski, Mr. Kurtyka, everybody else, ladies and gentlemen, I'm signing off. Thank you very much.
Ja również dziękuję i na tym.
I also would like to thank, and by this we're concluding our today's meeting. I would like to thank our dear participants for taking part in this meeting. Thank you, historians. Thank you and goodbye. And please follow our other meetings organized by the Janusza Foundation. Thank you very much. Goodbye.